so on. Okay. Schönen Nachmittag, hallo. Ich freue mich, dass ihr alle da seid. War das eine gute D3-Con bis jetzt? Ich will... Wunderbar. Ja, wir legen jetzt los. Wir haben eine fantastische Keynote gleich, gefolgt von einem Panel zum Thema Sustainable Media, Sustainable Advertising. Und wir starten gleich mit der Keynote und ich freue mich, I'm switching now to English. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Coghlan, co-founder and COO of Scope3. And before you start, just very briefly, I'm super amazed that Anne is here because, you know, this recon has always been part of the fantastic development of programmatic advertising in the past. And Anne was part of that with a company called AppNexus and Xander. And then they actually moved into this new business. She, together with Brian O'Kelly, who was the founder of Xander and AppNexus, and now they are both co-founders of Scope3. Welcome to the stage, and we are absolutely happy to have you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this 4:30 p.m. Presentation on this Advertisers Day at D3Con. I changed the introduction that matched this slide yesterday on my way here when I read the news reports from the IPCC report, and I think what's really interesting about the title of this slide is there's no mention of the industry that we're working in. So from commitments to courage, I think is something that transcends advertising. It's also about us as human beings. And for me, what gave me hope as I was sitting preparing in my hotel room last night is that there is movement and we are moving into this second act of needing to really do something, not just in our personal lives, but also in the lives of us as advertising professionals to make sure that we have a planet to live on in, even 50 to 100 years' time. And so on that sobering note, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first act, so the acknowledgement of the need to really decarbonize. And we've seen that the industry has really embraced sustainability. So when myself and my co-founding team founded Scope3 at the beginning of January 2022, there was already movement and companies committing to do something to recognize the need to decarbonize. So the many logos on my slide, but I'm appreciating that there are even more if you're here in person, even more logos of companies that are working with us and acting. The logos on this slide are the many brands that are committed to the World Federation of Advertisers Planet Pledge. Lots of these companies, including major holding companies, have public commitments to achieve net zero goals by 2030, if you're the most ambitious, but at least by 2035 and 2040, to try and really galvanize everyone to mitigate the global temperature rises that we're seeing. So we know that their commitment is there, and we're really seeing at Scope3 the excitement and desire to really come together and decide how to turn these commitments into action. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, because, and this is the spoiler for the end, is I think who is driving the second act? It's all of us. It's all the people in this room. It's all the people, outside that should be in this room listening to this talk, because really this is not just about advertising. So to turn those commitments into action, we have the data and tools needed to decarbonize programmatic. So at Scope3, we've built a model that enables all companies to understand and measure the carbon footprint of their digital advertising. And now it's time to do something about that. What I wanted to do to kind of help all people in this room is to think through some of the common myths of decarbonisation when you're deciding how to use your time to act. So yesterday, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, I think maybe this is the first time today that someone has been able to reference the UN Secretary General in their speech. He said that we need to do everything, everywhere, all at once. So although that's also a really nice nod to the Oscars, I think it gives us an insight into what we really need to be doing. But as working professionals, we only have a certain amount of time in our day. And I think the rise of the interest in sustainability means that there are lots of solutions that may seem easy, some may seem easier than others, but we want to understand what is the true impact that these decisions and this way of thinking is having, because we know that we need to be moving fast. We can't wait 5 years and decide what comes up and then act, given the situation that we're in as a global community. So the first myth that I hear quite a lot is that using dark mode or mono for creatives is a good way to reduce carbon emissions. Where does this come from? Well, if you think about the digital ecosystem, really the carbon emissions are coming from electricity use. So electricity use from your phone, electricity use really from all of the servers that are powering this ecosystem. But actually, thinking and focusing just on creative is not really the solution, because what we see at Scope 3 is that the majority of emissions actually come from the supply chain. So the mechanisms that the digital ecosystem, particularly in programmatic, have been so innovative at creating over the years has caused a real web, for want of a better term, of emissions that really cause a lot of problems. So just to take a step back, where emissions actually come from. There we go. This is the Germany ecosystem. We see the majority of emissions from our data coming from ad selection. So ad selection are all the different pieces and players that combine together when you're deciding which ad shows to which user on which device. And the kind of plethora of companies that are involved in that mean that most of the ad tech emissions from all of the different servers is the source of the problem. You can see that 2%, which is the creative distribution emissions, is really not the focus of the problem. So switching from light to dark creatives, reducing assets, can maybe reduce that 2% as a total number, but really you want to be focusing on ad selection as the core piece. And to bring this to light a little bit, we have a couple of domains where you can see what that actually looks like. So here, the ad tech partner graph, that's that web that I was talking about. Each one of those dots, and apologies, it's not super clear on the big screen, represents one company. And one company that's being called, usually in a pre-bid context, when a user visits a website. So you can see here that the ad selection emissions are 0.086 grams of carbon. And for another publisher domain in kind of the same vertical, so these are both news websites, actually has a 17 times difference in the total emissions, and it's all based on that complex, messy graph. So if you're an advertiser and you're thinking, how can I reduce the carbon footprint of my campaign? It's probably good to look at the publishers that you're buying from and start to optimize away from these publishers and towards these publishers. Now, having worked in the programmatic ecosystem for many years, I know that it's not as simple as that, because you need to think about performance, and so I'll come on to that later. And for many people in this room, if you're interested in sustainability, I'm sure that you saw some live examples in the masterclass that MIQ and Essence Mediacom did this morning. The second myth I want to talk about is offsetting. So a lot of companies come to us and say, great, I want to measure the carbon footprint of my campaign, and then I can buy some cheap offsetting carbon credits, and I'm carbon neutral, right? I don't need to do anything else. I've balanced the books, I've balanced the weighing scales, and the world will be a better place thanks to me. Well, actually, what we see is that that's not working. Reduction really should always be the first priority. And we also see that navigating the complex system of carbon voluntary markets is, I'm going to say, almost as complicated as navigating the advertising ecosystem for someone who's not inside it. So I wanted to give a quick snapshot of once you have done the reduction, what it looks like to remove carbon from the atmosphere in a high quality way. And I'm not going to go through these, but I thought it would be, I'm sure people would take a photo, but I thought it would be interesting just to look at the criteria required to think about removing carbon from the atmosphere to create a carbon neutral campaign or to create carbon neutral media, because the bar needs to be really high. We need to be sure that we are actually taking carbon from the atmosphere, first by reducing our own practices, and then second by offsetting where the carbon can't be reduced anymore. And I think that this is really, really critical when recognizing that it's not super easy to do this. It takes some time, and it takes the courage to do some of the hard work, do some of the analysis, to measure and then understand where reductions can happen first. The third myth is I just need to be better than my peers, essentially. And this is something that we hear a lot from first kind of conversations with both brands and with publishers and with people all throughout the ecosystem, which is, okay, so what's the average carbon for my campaign? How does that compare with my competitors? Or if you're a publisher, which graph am I? Am I the one on the left or the one on the right? That's really good to start thinking competitively about how you can reduce as a race to the bottom. And when I say race to the bottom here, I mean it probably for the first time in ad tech in a good sense of getting to the point of as low a carbon footprint as possible. But really, we need to be thinking much more about benchmarking against ourselves. So how do we reduce the waste in digital? And how can we pull every lever possible to really be mitigating these issues that are beyond the advertising ecosystem? Now, the good news here, and again, I'm referencing the masterclass that I'm sure everyone attended this morning if you're interested in this topic, is that there is a real benefit in thinking about carbon emissions, not just from a good of the planet and meeting my company or my advertisers' net zero goals, but also on performance as well. So we ran a study with Ubiquity at the end of last year, and we saw that a significant amount of ad spend is wasted on made for advertising inventory. And not only that, those websites have 26% higher emissions than content created for the purposes of actually creating the content, not created for advertising purposes. And so you start to see a real correlation between true performance metrics for the brand and actually reducing emissions as well. So these actually go hand in hand. And we can actually see that in some cases it can boost performance. So this is taken from the top domains in Germany. Each dot represents a website. The larger the dot, the more users visit that site in a time period. And what we see is for this number of impressions actually reducing, so I'm going to take some domains out, reduces the carbon by 9.9%, but also increases some of the performance metrics that the brand was tracking. Removing 20% of domains has an even more significant impact. And so actually the hope here is that by thinking about reducing carbon emissions, you're actually also getting better results and more effective results from the media. So I think this is kind of thinking through and reimagining the ecosystem that we're in that makes it more sustainable, not just from a world perspective, from making sure that we don't go over that 1.5 degree global warming target that we're dangerously and precariously close to hitting, but also reimagining this ecosystem where advertising is more effective, hits advertiser goals, and does potentially educates as well consumers on this move to a more sustainable ecosystem. And so I encourage each and every one of you to be part of the driver of this second act of sustainable advertising. And so I really would say the first step is to learn. So think and understand, think through some of these myths that you're hearing, do a little bit of digging, dive a little bit deeper into understanding what the carbon footprint is of your advertising, and then take steps to measure that before deciding on the action that can be taken with partners across the ecosystem to really drive reduction that we can do together in a systemic way. That means that we could potentially be one of the first industries to decarbonize. And so I'm just going to leave it on this final slide, which is, I think, the outcome that we at Scope 3 are trying to help all players in the industry achieve is that we want to have the least possible impact on the environment per unit of effective advertising. And so I think it's up to all of you and all of us to think about how we minimize that impact on the environment and how we make sure that advertising remains effective and relevant. Thank you.